Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. They have feet in both worlds. They are the immigrants in the global city. They are part of the growing population of transnationals. They use modern technology, cell phones, the internet, cheap airfares to remain in constant contact with their hometowns and country. They are Mexicans in New York. To provide us an intimate look at migration and globalization as it is lived by Mexicans in New York and in Mexico is Robert Smith, a colleague of mine at the School of Public Affairs at Baruch College and author of the recently published Mexican New York: Transnational Lives of New Immigrants. Welcome, Rob.
Pleasure to be here, Doug.
This is a nice job. Great reviews. Wait a minute. Classic ethnography. Best ethnography of migration that I have ever read. And indeed, I found it a warm, rich, nuanced study. I mean, you really have lived, chronicled, and reimagined the human experience in what you and others call this transnationalism. What is this transnationalism? What are its characteristics? And how do these transnational migrants differ from our ancestors?
The basic idea is in the late 80s, early 90s, scholars began to notice that migrants were coming to the United States, but they weren't doing the things that migration theory said they should, that they should stay here, they break ties with the old country, they come to the new country, but in fact they were increasingly keeping those ties, and not only were they keeping those ties, but the home countries, the sending country governments were trying to cultivate those ties. So people realized there was something new going on here.
And how new is it? I mean, does it differ, and how does it differ from the past? Is it simply technological, that those attitudes and behaviors might have existed before and they're just unable to be expressed, or is it different culturally, if you will?
That's a good question. I mean, people first thought, oh, we've discovered something new, right? Then people started looking back in history, and they realized there was a lot of transnational activity among Italians 100 years ago, for example, among the Irish, nationalism, things like that. But what's different about it is the simultaneity now, right? I mean, you know, in the book I talk about these guys who are major politicos in the town that they're from. They paid $100,000 out of $150,000 worth of a huge public works project in their home village, and they all had jobs in New York. Mm-hmm. And they'd fly down Friday night on a red eye, negotiate for 2 days with the local authorities, and come back to work Monday morning. You couldn't do that 100 years ago.
So they negotiate both of these worlds, but at the same time that they're in both of the worlds, they're in between. Certainly, you know, as you talk about the adolescence being in between, this notion of not exactly of one or the other. Now, how does this transnationalism differ from notions of assimilation? You began to touch on it earlier. Are they mutually exclusive or not, as you argue?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because people often think, right? And you hear about immigration debates now about people. You know, there's a lot of people commenting if they continue to stay connected to the home country, they're not assimilating. This is actually not the case. In fact, what scholars have found is that the people who are more fully assimilated, meaning that they're participating economically in the U.S., they're doing well educationally, many of them are more likely to be more transnationally involved. They just have a higher level of civic participation and more means to do so. They're more likely to be U.S. citizens, they're more likely to have gone to college and such, and they're the people who have the means to come and go.
So in a sense, you've just described the indicators of what assimilation is, and many of these folks exhibit those. And you're saying, in fact, that they're mutually reinforcing in many ways rather than being negating of one another, or at least sometimes they are.
Yeah, not all the time, but much of the time they are. I'd even go further than that and say, if you look at Mexicans in New York now, you've got this very interesting sort of bifurcated set of futures, right? You've got about a third of the women and a fifth of the men who are upwardly mobile in the second generation, and the 1.5 generation, I mean, they were born in Mexico but raised here from age 10 or so onwards.
Okay, so first generation of the immigrants themselves, 1.5 is?
Born in Mexico, raised from age 10 or before, and second generation is born here. So the children of immigrants.
And then third is the children of those second generation children. Okay.
So you've got those guys, a significant number are upwardly mobile, but you have a lot who are getting stuck educationally. Mexicans have the highest rate of not being in school or not graduated from high school of any group in the city. 47% versus 22 for Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, 18 for African Americans, 7 for whites. There's a variety of reasons. One of them is, and this is all coming back to the assimilation transnational question in a minute, but one of them is that a lot of these guys are coming up as teenagers and they don't actually go into school, right? They come up 15, 16, boom, they go to work.
You use the word guys. Are you referring to mainly men in the generic sense?
There's more men than women in the recent immigrants, but it's not just a sort of solo male migration pattern. At this point, you've got everybody coming.
As you can see on the streets of New York, on 38th Street and Farmingdale and Jersey.
No, you've got everybody coming, and actually Mexicans almost any minute have surpassed Dominicans as the group with the largest number of births in New York City. The lines have been going like this. Dominican births are going down, Mexican births are going up.
And the Mexican population, I mean, let's just give a little profile here. There were about 300,000 counted Mexicans in the census, between 275
and 300,000. Not counted, that's my estimation.
Okay, that's your estimation of the total.
Of the total. So it's probably about 450,000 now in New York City.
2005.
In 2006, 2005. So it will probably hit somewhere between 550 and 600 by the next census.
And we're talking about 100,000 in 1990 and only 40,000 in 1980.
Yeah, so and those are estimates. Those are my estimates. So it was lower than that by the census numbers
because you're counting some estimate of undocumented.
Yeah.
So you're talking about an explosion.
Yeah, no, the growth has been tremendous. And, and you see it. You go into some New York City public schools in neighborhoods that were previously Puerto Rican or Dominican or whatever, huge numbers of Mexicans. You go, there's 5 or 6 little Mexicos throughout the city now.
Where?
Sunset Park, Corona, Jackson Heights, South Bronx, El Barrio in, Spanish Harlem. There's even some on Staten Island. So...
and they are fairly concentrated, or are they more dispersed?
Well, I mean, this is what's different than lots of other groups, right? That you've got, Dominican, the symbolic centers of Dominican life in New York, Washington Heights, Jackson Heights. I mean, they're all over the place, but you've got those two places. With Mexicans, you have, it's a much more dispersed thing. And actually, if you look at a map of the, like a map drawn from INS data from like 1980, 1990, the thing that impresses you is how random the settlement patterns are. They're all over, but over time, they've concentrated in these 5 or 6 neighborhoods.
Which makes political, accumulation of political and social power more difficult the more dispersed you are geographically.
There's that, and then there's also the fact that it's an overwhelmingly, especially among new entrants, undocumented population.
Okay, so let's go back to the school. So that's part of the problem as well. I mean, you've got an economic problem, you've got an education problem, and part of it is because of their undocumented status, at least in part.
Yeah.
What else?
So you've got the dispersion. The parents have fairly low levels of education, and it's also, I think, having people dispersed over the city makes it harder for American institutions to respond, right? I mean, Dominicans concentrated in a couple of places. Politicians can go to Washington Heights. They created a Dominican district. It was you could do something.
Now they elect Dominican representatives, so you've got power.
Right. But you've got Mexicans with 450,000 people in New York, and there's no visible elected representative. That will change within the next 10 years. But
what about the social nonprofit and economic infrastructure, private business infrastructure. Does it exist, and how does it exist?
Yeah, it's growing. I mean, there's a lot of Mexican entrepreneurs. I mean, the census reports a very low rate of self-employment, something like 3%. That's wrong. I mean, and it's probably wrong because most of these guys probably don't report themselves as self-employed. They probably have other jobs, but
and a lot of it's just the underground economy.
A lot of it is, but a lot of these guys are opening, legit formal businesses, the whole thing. So there's a lot of that, and there's, in terms of civic organization, the interesting thing about Mexicans in New York in terms of civic organization is this: everybody and his uncle has an organization, right? I mean, and literally, right? And it's, the clubes de oriundos, the community of origin clubs. Everybody's got one from your hometown. They got a soccer team. They got something that collects money, to send back for whatever it's going to be. But what's curious about it is that most of these organizations are not linked up with American institutions in any way. And so this is a lost opportunity for New York. It's not permanently lost, right? This is a thing that can be changed. There are a number of homegrown organizations that have responded to local needs. Asociación Tepeyac has been very, very successful. They were in organizing. It's a Catholic church organization run by Brother Joel. They did amazing work after 9/11 in particular. They really, really did amazing service there. Another organization that has grown in the last few years has been MASA, the Mexican American Students Alliance, which is working with CUNY now.
Wait a minute, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
I'm on the train yesterday, the 6th train, reading this book. Now this is not, this is not Stephen King.
Right.
It's not Dale Brown. It's not Dan Brown. Person walks up to me and says, "What do you think of the book?" So I said, "It's really quite good." And he gives me a card, and it is Angelo Cabrera
Get
of
out
MASA.
of town. Oh, my God.
So we're talking about, I know him, and he's doing this. So there are Mexican-Americans out there. They're reading the book. I was utterly flabbergasted. Talk about this organization.
So this Angelo, that's 1,000,001. There's 8 million people in New York. What are the chances, right?
Forget it.
All right, so Angelo forms this group. It comes in the wake of 9/11 as well. He's working, MASA is working with the nonprofit I co-founded, MEXED, the Mexican Educational Foundation.
Okay, I was going to do that later. Let's do MEXED.
Well, we got this now, right?
Yeah, let's do this. Let's talk about this.
All right, so there are, in fact, civic organizations that are responding to these needs, right? I mean, you've got this tremendous need for some sort of set of organizations that support Mexican students in New York. And MASA, Angelo's organization, and MEXED have tried to respond to this. So part of the idea is that where part of the problem is happening in school, part of the problem is happening in the after school at 3 to 7 hours. But part of it also is in the set of beliefs that people have and the educational aspirations that they have. Lots of Mexicans tell me, students, I did a big study, 5 years, looking at second generation 1.5 and new immigrants' school and work trajectories in adolescence when they're teens, right? And I'm following this up now in early adulthood. A lot of them told me, well, it's really good to go to college, but Mexicans don't go to college.
Like Italians don't go to college.
Like it was just a belief. Yeah. Oh, obviously you do better. Oh, I want to do this, but I don't know anyone that went to college. There's no Mexicans go to college. This is first not true, but secondly, if you believe this, what's it going to do? Yeah, it's real. If you think that this is so, it's so. Well, what we've been able to do is we've worked with CUNY, we've worked with the consulate.
Talk about MEXED. Talk about that work.
So MEXED and MASA have worked with the consulate and with CUNY to we do outreach to people. We have and it's like we have a meeting in a room like this size and 300 people show up, right, to get applications to CUNY, and we help them to fill the applications out. We let them know that even if you're undocumented, you can still go to college, because lots of people believe that they don't, right? So you then have a big segment of the population that's undocumented, and then they say, oh, well, you can't go if you're not documented, and then they say to the other kids, well, don't go because they're just like fooling with you. Nobody really wants you to go. Imagine you change everybody's aspirations. And so we're working in Washington Irving High School, we're working in St. Jerome's Parish in the South Bronx, and it's on a small scale now, but it's having a really positive effect.
And MexEd is, you co-founded it. It is a 501c3 nonprofit that attempts to instill the values and provide the opportunities
and
for
to give
education.
the concrete support, right? I mean, you think about what's the difference between Mexican community in New York and Korean or Chinese community. The kids in the Chinese and Korean communities have a lot of these kinds of organizations to help them. They have somewhere they got to go between 3 and 6, and you go into a lot of these other community organizations, and there's CUNY applications sitting on the table, right? I want that to be what happens in every Mexican
Is it generational? Will it change over time? And I want to get into the actual relationships that you talk here.
Yes, it will change over time, but you know what?
Indigenously, I mean, in terms of the community itself generating.
It's not simply that. I mean, people, it's kind of a paradox, right? People have really high educational aspirations, but the actual institutional supports for people to do that don't really exist. And so people's their expectations are different than their aspirations. They don't expect to get very far, but they really want to. So you put those high aspirations together with more institutional support, and it can be very powerful. Now, on this, I should also mention that not only are MASA and MexEd working on this, and others, right? Tepeyac does work on this.
Wait, but before you go on, does MexEd have a website? How does a Mexican or non-Mexican contact you to avail themselves of what you offer?
We are so young as a nonprofit. We don't have a website yet, but they can email me.
Go ahead.
Robert_Smith@baruch.cuny.edu. If you don't remember that after seeing the program, you just go ahead and go to the website at CUNY, the Baruch website. And I will get back to you, and we'll put you in touch. We're going to have, here's the next piece of this, right? So you got these civic organizations that are working very hard to do this stuff, but small organizations can't do the whole thing. Well, CUNY and the consulate signed a memorandum of understanding this summer, and this fall, and the chancellor and the consul were, they were justly celebrating about it. And what it does is it commits both institutions to taking certain measures to increase the number of Mexicans applying to CUNY and getting through it. So, for example, we're going to train as CUNY ambassadors certain Mexican community leaders in how to help people fill out their CUNY applications, telling them if you're undocumented, you can go. No, and there's a campaign that we're gonna be mounting called Si Se Puede, Yes You Can. Si Se Puede con CUNY, Yes You Can with CUNY. So, I mean, this is like the coolest thing that I've seen in a long time, because you've got these major institutions committing themselves to doing this work, and it's at a very propitious moment. This is a key moment. You've got this huge problem. You've got this in terms of people dropping out of school. You've got this major institution committing itself. CUNY could make a serious difference in the future of the Mexican community in New York, and so in New York's future as well.
And the consulate is very active in engaging the Mexican American community. As you know, I'm involved with the CUNY project along with you to train mid-level and higher level nonprofit executives in basic management, strategy, and leadership. And again, the consulate is fostering this to build up the social infrastructure in the setting.
This guy's really good. His name is Arturo Sarucan. He has moved with great alacrity and with a great deal of skill to actually get a lot of work done in terms of helping to build these institutional links. The guy, I wish the guy could get another term here in the next after the next presidential
impressive
elections.
Character.
Yeah, no,
absolutely impressive.
He's done good work.
Let's talk about the book and the methodology. I mean, let's be a little professorial.
Let's come back
here
to the transnational issue for 2 seconds.
Okay, go.
Well, we were talking about it before. Assimilation and transnationalism, are they consistent or not? So I said that, in fact, in many cases, more assimilated people, more integrated people are more transnational. I would even take this further. You've got all these sorts of social challenges that the community faces. It would be possible to use transnational engagement to help promote positive assimilation, and by, in fact, increasing the extent to which a lot of these guys go, and women, in which these second-generation kids go back, creating programs that are stronger, right? I mean, think about, Jewish youth going back to Israel and stuff like that, or going, I often use the example of the Catskills camps, right, from the 40s to the 70s. These were places where people, met their future spouses, where they had, they developed a Jewish identity, where, you know, the ethic of educational achievement, all these things were reinforced.
Right.
And it wasn't like they were there the whole year. They were probably there for 6 or 8 weeks or
Right.
something. Well, I don't see any reason why, since you already have so many people going back for visits, why you could not incorporate something like that. It's a very, very potentially powerful thing. So you could use more transnational engagement to promote more positive assimilation.
I mean, well, I mean, you see your job as a professor not only to study the world, but to change it, in fact.
It's the hope.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
look at the study.
Okay.
This is an ethnography. It's a reflexive case study. It's a product of, it's really astounding, 15 years of research where you totally immersed yourself in the lives of these folks, weddings, funerals, christenings, religious rituals, races. Describe your life, how you did it, and the advantages and disadvantages as a scholar.
Yeah. I often tell my graduate students, don't do what I did.
Sounds like the parents' warning.
Don't write a proposal where you say, I mean, I didn't write the proposal this way, but never say, I'm going to spend the next 15 years on this, right? Because I didn't plan to do a 15, you know, it's actually, at this point, it's 18.
Oh, okay.
Right?
I'm sorry.
You know, because it was 2005. I was still, I'm writing it and I'm still doing field work for it. I mean, the ethnography basically, the key to ethnography is that the quality of the data you get depends on the quality of the relationships you develop with people, in addition to your theoretical sophistication and all that. And so, you know, I joke that I turned the inability to disengage with my field work into a virtue by making it a long-term, a longitudinal study. Now, there's a thing called life course studies, right? And that usually is done with statistics because you watch how people's lives
Right.
change over time.
Right.
You have to go through from, you know, it's either adolescence to early adulthood to full adulthood, whatever. This is the only sort of life course ethnography I can imagine, because you got to be involved with the people the whole time.
During their life course,
So,
during their
yeah.
significant events. I mean, the level of familiarity is astounding here. Then what you did was you took residents of New York who are Mexican, who come from a particular town in a particular region in southern Mexico. And you look at them when you call key sites for analyzing transitional life. You look at their politics, their gender relationships, and their assimilation experiences. Talk about each of these, how it elucidates and explains the concept of transnationalism.
Okay, so I looked at, for example, politics, local politics.
In Mexico.
In Mexico, all right?
And the name of the town?
The name I use is Tijuani,
Okay.
which comes from the dance of the Tijuanis, which is a ritual dance of the actual name of the town,
Okay.
or of the actual town. So I look at this over time, right? How, in fact, local political decisions are made and how the role of people in New York change. And what I studied was, there's a thing that I call in the book the committee. It's the Tijuani Committee of New York. And the committee is a group of really hardworking men who have spent the last 30 years raising money in New York to do public works projects back in their hometown. I mean, there's amazing dedication and devotion. At the beginning of the program, I talked about the fact these guys raised 100 grand out of 150 grand to put a new potable water project in the town, right? The biggest public work that's ever been done there. So they raised twice as much as the state, local, and federal governments combined. Over the course of this 15, 18 years that I've been studying this, the stance of these guys in New York changed from being one of, can we please come and help serve, to being, you know, we are making major sacrifices. You need to recognize us as people who are important.
So you have conflict between the indigenous political elites and the groups in New York?
They probably object to the word conflict,
Okay.
but what you but I don't know if I necessarily would. But what you have then is, I mean, think of it this way: the state raises money, taxes people to raise money to pay for public works.
Right.
The state in Tijuani can't raise the money because everybody earning money lives in New York.
Right.
So the guys in New York raise the money, but they're not the state. So you now got the elected officials who have to negotiate with these guys
Okay.
in New York, right? The guys in New York say that these guys are all corrupt. So they're saying, we're not giving you the money unless you meet our conditions.
Okay.
So this is why you end up getting the scene of these guys flying down Friday night to negotiate all weekend with the guys in Mexico.
And it's got electoral consequences as well. And then let's move on to gender and
Right.
assimilation.
So in terms of electoral consequences, you get an opening up of the political system in the late 90s, in 98, because the dominant party, the PRI, begins losing elections because they basically have been el dedazo, right? They've been using the fingertip to pick candidates.
Right.
As soon as there's primaries, boom, you get a split in the community in New York because there's a guy, a political boss, and there's a political boss in Tijuana who has been sort of dedazoing everybody, right? And so these teachers run an alternative slate, and because they have the money now, like $1,400 and something bucks to actually mount a campaign, they beat this guy.
Okay, so to politics, there changes. Let's look at gender relations. You talk about the differences between first and second generation women versus men in the two locations. Talk about briefly how this is all negotiated.
I mean, what's interesting, the dominant image, if you look at migration studies, is that people coming from other countries, there's old, bad, patriarchal gender relations there, and they come to the United States, and it's new, egalitarian, better relationships, right? And, I mean, there's some truth in this, that the U.S. is less patriarchal, but there's a lot of patriarchy in American gender relations. And not only that, you go back to the towns in Mexico, and those gender relations are changing too. So what I tried to do in this analysis was to look at different cases of how actual couples negotiated their gender relations. And I looked at two cases, one of whom is a man who's honored for his sacrifice of spending all these weekends gathering money, and the other one who is whose family thinks it's a sort of macho self-indulgence. And I asked the question, why does one family say this guy, his sacrifice is our sacrifice too, and the honor is ours too, and the other one says, well, he just leaves us alone all the time. The difference is that I was able to trace is that in the one case, the man had changed his gender ideology. He used the words "I evolved," and he said there's this great quote. What good does it do me to come to a super world city, una ciudad supermundista, like a great invented word, and not change? I'd be better off to have never left, right? And he talks about how he took care of his kids, brought them to school, changed the diapers, all this kind of stuff that he wasn't supposed to do because it wasn't, quote unquote, manly, right? And he even had a confrontation with his father. He said, no, they're my kids. I want to do this stuff. The other guy really embraced this more macho position even more strongly, but his wife and his kids did not. So he really did all this sort of, he would go out drinking, he would never bring them socializing and all this stuff, but he ended up living alone in this sort of more macho world, whereas the other guy could do that stuff, and his family resented it, and whereas the other guy made these sacrifices and his family really revered him for it, and so it was a totally different thing.
15 seconds, we blew through this interview. Gangs, you point out that in a sense the gang was important, in this relationship the gang sort of was imported from the United States. Give me a real brief description of it.
Here's what happened. It's a difficult situation. You've got this you've got the amnesty program in the 90s. You get a huge family reunification in the early 90s. So you've got all these, instead of kids coming when they're 18 or 17 and going straight to work, they're coming at 10 and 12 and they're going into the schools. The kids already in the schools, Puerto Rican kids, black kids, and in some cases white kids, feel invaded by this because suddenly there's all these Mexicans in their school, right? All these Mexicans. And so they end up picking on these kids. The Mexicans form gangs to defend themselves. Then when they get in problems with other gangs or with the police, they go back to Mexico to hide, right, or to take refuge, and they start a gang down there.
Okay. 5 seconds. One thing that I was struck with is the apparent racism of the Mexicans towards Puerto Ricans and blacks. No culture, they rob, they steal. I could only define it as racist. Why?
Well, I would talk about it as an essential dimension. In the book, I talk about how this racialization is part of the assimilation process. If you look at the history of Irish relationships, right, Irish-black relationships over history, the Irish, in fact, learned to become American by becoming anti-black.
Okay.
Mexicans have been taught the same lesson, although they're not assimilating it completely, hopefully.
We need to talk more. You have to come back.
No, this would be great.
Are you continuing this?
Oh, this is book 1 of 3.
Oh, got to stop. Thank you.